The year is 2019. A teenage girl walks onto the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan, the most powerful aircraft carrier on Earth. She is 19 years old. She weighs 127 pounds, and every single pilot on that deck, decorated veterans, combat aces, men who had logged thousands of flight hours, turned to look at her and laughed. Not smiled, not smirked, laughed. One of them said out loud what everyone was thinking. They sent us a child. But here is the thing nobody in that crowd knew yet. That child had already done something that none of them had ever done. Something that the Navy's own flight instructors called statistically impossible. And within 14 months, she would not just silence every single one of those laughing men, she would be giving them orders. This is the true story of Maya Reyes, the youngest flight commander in United States naval history. And it begins not on a carrier deck. It begins in a trailer park in Laredo, Texas, with a little girl staring up at the sky. Maya Reyes was 7 years old the first time she understood what it meant to be told no. Not the soft kind of no, not the gentle, parental kind that comes with an explanation and a cookie afterward. This was the hard kind, the kind that lands in your chest like a stone and just sits there. Her father, Carlos Reyes, had taken her to the Laredo Air Show on a Saturday afternoon in the summer of 2007. It was the kind of day that burns itself into memory. The air smelled like funnel cake and jet fuel. The sky was wide and white-hot, and every few minutes, a fighter jet screamed overhead so low and so fast that the sound hit you like a physical thing, like a wall of noise that rattled your teeth and made your heart skip. Maya had stood there with her neck craned back, mouth open, watching an F/A-18 Hornet tear a vertical line straight up into the sky, just gone, disappearing into the blue like it had been swallowed, and she had felt something happen inside her that she would spend the next 12 years chasing. It wasn't excitement, it was recognition. Like something in her chest looked up at that jet and said, "That is where I belong." She turned to her father and said, very simply, very seriously, the way only 7-year-olds can be serious, "Dad, I'm going to fly one of those." Carlos Reyes was a good man, a quiet man. He worked double shifts at a sheet metal factory and came home smelling like iron and machine oil, and he loved his daughter with everything he had. But he was also a practical man, the kind that poverty makes you eventually. And so he looked down at his daughter and said, "Mija, girls like us don't fly jets. That's not our world." He wasn't being cruel. He genuinely believed it. Because in his world, in their world, it was simply true. Nobody from the Reyes family had ever gone to college. Nobody had ever left Laredo except to find harder work somewhere else. The idea of his daughter becoming a Navy pilot was not a dream, it was a fantasy. And fantasies, he believed, were dangerous things to hand to children who couldn't afford the fall. So he said no, and Maya nodded, and they drove home. But something had already been decided, not by her father, not by their circumstances, not by the world's quiet insistence that certain doors were not built for certain people. Something had been decided by that girl herself in the 2 seconds she watched that jet disappear into the sky. She just didn't say it out loud again for a long time. Maya grew up in a 2-bedroom trailer on the south side of Laredo, 12 minutes from the Mexican border, in a neighborhood where the streetlights went out more often than they worked. She shared a room with her younger brother, Diego, and the walls were so thin that in winter she could feel the cold coming through them like a slow tide. They were not miserable. That is important to understand. The Reyes household was full of food most of the time, full of noise always. Her mother, Lucia, cooked in massive quantities, rice, beans, tamales on weekends, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the trailer, physically and otherwise. There was music, there was laughter, There was love in the dense, stubborn, wordless way that families who survive together tend to love each other. But there was also limitation. Constant, quiet, suffocating limitation. She could feel it the way you feel a ceiling in a room that is just slightly too low. You don't hit your head, not always, but you are always aware of it, always slightly crouched, always slightly smaller than you want to be. She was 13 when she found the library book that changed her. It was not a famous book. It was not the kind of book that gets quoted in speeches or listed on books that changed my life threads on the internet. It was a thin, slightly water-damaged biography of Rosemary Mariner, the first woman to command a tactical air squadron in the United States Navy. Maya found it on a cart of discarded books outside the Laredo Public Library, the kind of cart that says, "Free, take one." She took it because the cover had a jet on it. She read it in one night, sitting on the bathroom floor after everyone else was asleep, because the bathroom was the only room in the trailer where she could keep a light on without waking her brother. She read it twice, and then she sat there on that cold tile floor, back against the bathtub, and she made herself a promise. Not a wish, not a hope, a promise. She was going to fly. Not someday, not maybe, not if things worked out. She was going to fly, and she was going to fly jets, and nobody, not poverty, not geography, not anyone who had ever looked at her and seen only what she lacked, was going to be the thing that stopped her. She was 13 years old. She had exactly 0 resources, 0 connections, 0 flight hours, and a father who believed, with love and genuine conviction, that this was not their world. She started the next morning anyway. She didn't know it yet, but the path she was about to walk, alone, without a map, without a guide, would take her somewhere that nobody in her family had ever stood. Somewhere that nobody who had laughed at her on that carrier deck had ever expected to look up and see. But before any of that, before the carrier, before the flight tests, before the day her name appeared on a command roster that made senior officers stop and read it twice, there was a flight school in San Antonio that told her she wasn't good enough. And what she did next changed everything. The rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday. Maya was 16 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing calculus homework when her mother set the envelope down in front of her without a word. Maya Reyes didn't know what was inside it, but she had seen enough envelopes in her life to recognize the weight of bad news. There is something about the way they sit on a surface, something flat and final, that gives them away before you even open them. Maya looked at the return address. Southwest Aerospace Academy, San Antonio, Texas. She had applied 3 months ago. She had filled out every form by hand, twice, once as a draft, once as the final copy, because they required neat handwriting and she wanted it to be perfect. She had written a personal essay that took her 11 drafts and 4 weeks. She had asked her physics teacher, Mr. Dominguez, to write her a recommendation letter, and he had told her afterward, quietly, almost reverently, that it was the strongest letter he had ever written for a student in 22 years of teaching. She had done everything right. She opened the envelope. "Dear Miss Reyes, thank you for your application to the Southwest Aerospace Academy Summer Intensive Program. After careful review, we regret to inform you." She didn't read the rest. Not right then. She folded the letter back along its original creases, put it back in the envelope, and went to finish her calculus homework. Her mother watched her from across the kitchen, waiting. Maya didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just picked up her pencil and found her place on the page. That scared Lucia more than tears would have. Later that night, after Diego was asleep and her father was watching television in the other room, Maya unfolded the letter and read the whole thing. The reason they gave was standard, careful, legally vague, the competitive nature of the program and the limited number of available spots. But Maya had talked to a girl from her school, Daniela Voss, who had also applied. Daniela had a B- average in physics. Daniela had never expressed a serious interest in aviation before the application. Daniela had a father who was a commercial airline pilot and a mother who sat on the San Antonio school board. Daniela got in. Maya sat with that information for a long time. She did not let herself turn it into bitterness. She could feel the temptation of it, that hot, easy pull toward anger, toward the story where the world is simply rigged and effort is pointless and the game was never fair, so why keep playing? She could feel how seductive that story was, how comfortable, how it would explain everything and require nothing. She refused it. Not because she was naive, not because she didn't understand what had happened. She refused it because she had read enough about the people she admired to know that bitterness was a weight you carried yourself. The people who put it on you never felt it, only you did. So, she made a different choice. She picked up a pen and started a list. The list had one heading at the top, underlined twice. What I can do right now, today, with what I actually have. It sounds simple. It was not simple. It took her 2 hours to write, not because there were many things on it, but because she forced herself to be brutally honest. No fantasy items, no if only I had money items, no items that required someone else to open a door for her. Only real things. Concrete things, things that were available to a 16-year-old girl in Laredo, Texas, with no money, no connections, and a rejection letter on the table in front of her. When she was done, the list had 4 items on it. 1. The Laredo Flying Club met every Saturday morning at the municipal airport. Membership was $20 a year. She had $23 in her drawer from babysitting. 2. YouTube. Specifically, the full playlist of MIT OpenCourseWare aerodynamics lectures. Free. Available tonight. 3. Mr. Dominguez had mentioned once, casually in passing, that his brother-in-law was a retired Air Force mechanic who sometimes let students come see the small planes he restored in his garage. She could ask. 4. The United States Navy had a program called the Naval Sea Cadet Corps, open to teenagers. Free to join. The nearest unit was 40 minutes away in Nuevo Laredo. 4 items. That was the whole list. She started on item 1 the next morning. The Laredo Flying Club was not glamorous. It operated out of a converted storage building on the edge of the municipal airport, a low concrete structure with bad lighting, folding chairs, and a coffee maker that had seen better decades. The average member was 53 years old, retired, and had been flying single-engine Cessnas as a hobby for longer than Maya had been alive. When she walked in that first Saturday, 11 men turned to look at her. The silence lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then a heavy-set man in a John Deere cap named Hector Fuentes, who would later become one of the most important people in Maya's life, pointed at the coffee maker and said, "You want some? It's terrible, but it's hot." She sat down. She listened. She asked 2 questions the whole morning, but she asked them so precisely, so specifically, that Hector Fuentes leaned back in his chair and looked at her differently than he had before. After the meeting, he asked her how old she was. She told him 16. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, I used to do ground instruction, informal, no charge." She said, "I know, someone told me." He raised an eyebrow. "Who told you?" "Nobody," she said. "I just assumed that a man who shows up every single week and pays $20 a year to talk about flying with people who already know how to fly, I assumed he'd rather be teaching someone who is just starting." Hector Fuentes stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a real laugh, full and surprised, and said, "Saturday mornings, 7 a.m. Don't be late." Over the next 18 months, Maya Reyes learned more about the theory of flight, aircraft mechanics, meteorology, navigation, and aeronautical decision-making than most people learn in 2 years of formal aviation school. She did it in a garage, on folding chairs, with printed handouts and a whiteboard marker that was always running out of ink. She logged her first actual flight hours in a 1974 Cessna 172 that had a crack in the dashboard and a compass that drifted 3 degrees west. She flew it anyway. She learned to compensate. She learned that imperfect tools, handled with precision and patience, could still take you exactly where you needed to go. She was 17 when she took her first solo flight. She didn't tell her parents until after she landed. Her father didn't speak for almost a full minute when she told him. Then he said, very quietly, "You're going to give me a heart attack, Mia." And Maya smiled and said, "Not until after I make commander, Dad." She said it like a joke. She was not joking. She was still a year away from the Navy, still years away from that carrier deck, still years away from the moment when a row of decorated pilots would look at her and laugh. But something had already begun, something that rejection letters and closed doors and competitive programs with limited spots could not touch. The foundation was being built. And in Chapter 3, she walks into the room where everything changes, the room where they test her, the room where even the people who believed in her weren't sure she'd make it through. What happened inside that room became the stuff of legend. There is a room at Naval Air Station Pensacola that pilots don't talk about much. Not because it's classified, not because there's anything physically extraordinary about it. It's a plain room. Fluorescent lights, gray walls, a single metal desk and a chair bolted to the floor. The kind of room that exists in every government building in America and means nothing to most people who walk past it. But in the naval aviation world, that room has a name. They call it the furnace. Not officially. Officially, it's Interview Room 4C, part of the Naval Aviation Officer Selection process. But every candidate who has ever sat in that chair knows the real name. Because what happens inside that room is not an interview in any normal sense of the word. It is a dismantling. The officer across the desk, whoever they send that day, is specifically trained to find the edge of you, the exact point where your confidence ends and your doubt begins. They will question everything. Your scores, your background, your reasons, your right to even be sitting in that chair. They will be polite about it, professional. They will never raise their voice. That almost makes it worse. Maya Reyes walked into that room on a Thursday morning in March 2019. She was 18 years old. She had her paperwork in a manila folder. She had slept 4 hours. She had eaten a granola bar in the parking lot because her stomach wouldn't hold anything else, and she was ready. The officer across the desk that morning was Commander Dale Hutchins, a 15-year Navy veteran, former FA-18 pilot with a face like weathered stone and eyes that had the particular quality of seeing through things rather than at them. He had conducted over 400 of these interviews. He knew within the first 90 seconds whether someone was going to make it. He looked at Maya's file for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at her. "Laredo, Texas," he said. Not a question, just a statement, like he was reading a word in a foreign language and wasn't sure what it meant yet. "Yes, sir," Maya said. "No family military background?" "No, sir." "No formal aviation academy?" "No, sir." "Your flight hours were accumulated in a 1974 Cessna at a municipal flying club under the informal instruction of a retired hobbyist." There was something in the way he said informal and hobbyist. Not contempt exactly, but a kind of precise neutrality that was almost worse than contempt. Like he was reading from a list of disqualifying factors and simply ticking boxes. "Yes, sir," Maya said. Her voice was even, completely even. Hutchins leaned back slightly. "Why should the United States Navy invest in you?" And this is where most candidates made their first mistake. Most of them answer that question with accomplishments, with scores, with the story of how hard they had worked and how much they wanted it. They answered it like a job interview, like a performance review, like they were trying to convince someone. Maya did not do that. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, short enough not to seem uncertain, and then she said, "With respect, Commander, I don't think that's the right question." Hutchins didn't move, didn't blink. "Is that so?" "The right question," Maya said, "is what the Navy loses if it doesn't, and the answer to that question is in my file." Silence. "Walk me through it," Hutchins said. "My simulator scores put me in the 97th percentile of first-time candidates nationally. My spatial reasoning assessment is the highest this office has recorded in 4 years. Your own evaluator wrote that in the margin on page 6. I taught myself aerodynamics from MIT courseware and flight theory from a man who flew Cessnas on weekends, and I still outscored candidates who attended formal academies with full scholarships. I did all of that without a single resource that the Navy provides its preferred candidates as a baseline." She paused. "Imagine," she said, "what I do with actual resources." Another silence. Longer this time. Hutchins looked at her with an expression that was impossible to read. Then he looked back down at the file. He turned to page 6. He read the margin note. He closed the file. "That's a confident statement," he said. "Yes, sir, it is." "Confidence gets people killed in a cockpit, Miss Reyes." "So does the absence of it," she said. "The pilots who scare me aren't the confident ones. They're the ones who freeze when the situation exceeds their self-image. I know exactly what I can do. I also know exactly what I can't. That distinction is what keeps people alive." Hutchins studied her for a long moment. Then he wrote something on the top of her file. She couldn't see what it was from where she was sitting. She found out 6 weeks later when her acceptance letter arrived. But the acceptance letter was only the beginning. Because what nobody tells you, what the brochures don't mention and the recruitment officers carefully avoid, is that getting accepted to naval aviation training and surviving naval aviation training are two completely different things. The official dropout rate for the primary flight training program at NAS Pensacola is listed as around 30%. That is the official number. The real number, the number that includes medical withdrawals, voluntary withdrawals, and the quiet administrative transfers that don't make it into any public statistic, is closer to 50. 1 in 2. And the ones who don't make it aren't weak people. They aren't unprepared people. Some of them are extraordinary people. People who simply hit a wall inside themselves that they didn't know was there until the pressure found it. Maya found her wall on week 7. It was a Thursday, overcast. The kind of Florida sky that sits low and gray and makes everything feel slightly compressed. She was in the cockpit of a T-6 Texan II, 2,000 feet above the Gulf of Mexico, practicing emergency procedures with her instructor, Lieutenant Commander Sandra Okofer, one of only a handful of female flight instructors in the program, and a woman who had, in 8 years of teaching, developed a reputation for a very specific kind of ruthlessness that her students eventually came to understand as love. Okofer cut the simulated engine without warning. Standard procedure. Maya had drilled it hundreds of times, but this time, for a reason Maya would spend weeks trying to understand, something in her mind went sideways. Not panic, something quieter and more dangerous than panic, a kind of paralysis, a half-second where every procedure she knew simply wasn't there, like reaching for a wall switch in a familiar room and finding only air. The half-second stretched. Okofer said nothing, watched, waited. 3 full seconds passed. Then something snapped back into place, some deep, trained part of Maya that existed below the fear, and her hands moved. Correct sequence, correct timing. She brought the aircraft through the procedure cleanly, professionally, exactly as trained. They landed without speaking. On the ground, Okofer climbed out, pulled off her helmet, and looked at Maya across the wing of the aircraft. "What happened up there?" she said. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I lost it. 3 seconds. I lost it completely." Okofer nodded slowly. She didn't minimize it. She didn't reassure. She said, "What are you going to do about it?" That night, Maya sat in her bunk long after lights out and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Laredo, about the letter on the kitchen table, about Hector Fuentes and his terrible coffee and his whiteboard marker running out of ink, about everything she had built out of nothing, piece by piece, without a map. She thought about those 3 seconds, and she made a decision, not a dramatic one, not a cinematic one, a quiet, private, utterly determined decision. She was not going to be someone who almost made it. She was going to be someone that this program had never seen before. She got up at 4 in the morning and started drilling. What she built over the next 7 months, the thing she became inside that training program, was something that even Commander Hutchins, who had written that note on the top of her file and never told anyone what it said, had not fully anticipated. In Chapter 4, she finishes training, she gets her wings, and she walks onto the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan for the first time. And the laughing begins. The USS Ronald Reagan is not a ship. That word, ship, is too small for what it actually is. At 1,092 feet long and 104,000 tons, it is essentially a floating city, a city with a population of 5,000 people, its own hospital, its own post office, its own television station, and a flight deck the size of 3 football fields laid end to end. When it moves through the ocean, it doesn't cut through the water so much as simply displace it. A slow, overwhelming, unstoppable kind of movement that makes you understand, physically, in your bones, what the word power actually means. Maya Reyes stood at the edge of that flight deck on a Tuesday morning in September 2020 and felt the Pacific wind hit her face like a wall. She was 19 years old. She had her wings, and she was terrified. Not of the ocean, not of the jets lined up on the deck behind her, not of the assignment itself. She was terrified in the specific, quiet way that comes when you have spent years fighting to get somewhere and you finally arrive, and suddenly the destination is real and solid and nothing like the version of it you carried in your head. She had imagined this moment hundreds of times. In the trailer, on the bathroom floor, in Hector Fuentes' garage, in the cockpit of a battered Cessna above the flat scrubland south of Laredo. The real thing was louder, saltier, more overwhelming. She picked up her bag and walked toward the island structure, the tall vertical command tower rising from the right side of the deck, to check in with her squadron. That was when she heard the first laugh. It started small, the way these things always do. She was crossing the deck, bag over her shoulder, dress uniform still crisp from the flight in, when she passed a group of 6 pilots standing near the nose of an FA-18. They were mid-conversation, the easy, loud, profane conversation of men who know each other well and have stopped monitoring what they say. She caught pieces of it as she walked past. Then one of them saw her. She heard the conversation stop, felt it, really. That particular quality of silence that happens when a group of people all notice the same thing at the same moment. Then a voice, male, unhurried, not cruel in any malicious sense, just the casual cruelty of someone who has never had to think about what his words land on. "Is that our new pilot? How old is she? 12? Laughter. Not all of them. 3, maybe 4. Maya did not stop walking, did not turn around, did not adjust her pace by a single step. But she heard it, every word of it, filed it away in a part of herself that was very quiet and very patient and very, very good at waiting. The squadron she had been assigned to was VFA-27, the Royal Maces, a legendary unit, one of the oldest strike fighter squadrons in naval aviation history. 12 pilots, all with combat experience, all with flight hours that dwarfed hers by factors she didn't bother calculating. The average pilot in VFA-27 had been flying Navy jets for 9 years. Maya had been flying Navy jets for 11 months. Her squadron commander was Commander Brett Lassiter, 41 years old, 2 combat deployments, a Silver Star, and a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second longer than necessary, the kind that is meant to establish something. He looked at her file with the same expression that Hutchins had used in that gray room in Pensacola, that careful, neutral, seeing through things look, and then he looked at her. "You're young," he said. "Yes, sir," Maya said. "The men in this squadron have forgotten more about carrier operations than you've learned." "Probably true, sir." "That doesn't bother you?" She thought about it for exactly 1 second. "It motivates me, sir." Lassiter studied her. Then he nodded, a single, precise nod that communicated nothing except that the conversation was over, and sent her to meet her fellow pilots. The introduction did not go well. There is a specific social architecture to a fighter squadron that outsiders don't immediately see. On the surface, it looks like a professional military unit, organized, hierarchical, disciplined, and it is all of those things. But underneath that structure, running through it like wiring through a wall, is something older and more tribal. A system of earned belonging, of respect that is granted not by rank, not by paperwork, not by what your file says, but by what you prove, in the air, in front of people who know exactly what they're watching. Maya had not yet proven anything. Not here, not to these people, and they made sure she knew it. It wasn't overt, nobody was unprofessional, nobody crossed a line that could be reported or documented. It was subtler than that, the kind of exclusion that operates through omission. Conversations that paused when she walked into the ready room and resumed at a slightly different angle. Briefings where her questions were answered correctly, but briefly, without the extra layer of context that experienced pilots give each other as a matter of course. Jokes told just loudly enough for her to hear and just quietly enough to deny. The pilot who was most openly skeptical was Lieutenant Commander James Hawk Harrington, 34 years old, 8 years of carrier experience, and the kind of physical confidence that comes from being the best at something for long enough that you've stopped remembering a time when you weren't. Hawk didn't dislike Maya. That was the complicated part. He wasn't hostile, he was simply completely, utterly unconvinced. He looked at her the way a master craftsman looks at an apprentice who has shown up with impressive references, with a patience that was also a kind of suspended judgment, a "we'll see" that filled every room he shared with her. On her third day aboard, he said it to her directly. They were in the ready room, just the two of them. He was reviewing flight data on a tablet. She was going over her carrier approach procedures for the 4th time that morning. He looked up and said without particular malice, "You know what your problem is?" She looked at him. "Tell me." "You got here too fast," he said. 11 months. Nobody gets good at this in 11 months. They get adequate, they get functional, but not good, not carrier qualified good. "And yet here I am," she said. "Yeah," he said, "here you are." The way he said it managed to make "here you are" sound like an accusation. Maya looked at him for a moment. Then she said something that Hawk Harrington would later admit, in an interview, years later when none of this was a secret anymore, had stopped him cold. She said, "I agree with you." He blinked. "What?" "You're right. 11 months isn't enough to be great at this. So I'm going to spend the next 11 months on this carrier becoming great. And when I'm done, you'll know. Not because I tell you, because you'll see it." She went back to her procedures. Hawk stared at her for a moment. Then he went back to his tablet. But something had shifted. Just slightly. Just barely. Like the first hairline crack in something that looks solid. She didn't know it yet, but that conversation was the beginning of the most important alliance of her career. In Chapter 5, Maya gets her first real test, a mission that goes wrong in a way nobody planned for, and the moment that changes how every single person on that carrier sees her. It happens at night, over open ocean, with no margin for error. There is a specific kind of darkness over the Pacific Ocean at 2 in the morning that has no equivalent on land. It is not simply the absence of light. It is something more total than that, something more deliberate. On land, even on the darkest night, there is always some reference, a tree line, a road, a distant glow from a town somewhere, something that tells your eyes where the ground is, something that anchors you. Over open ocean at night, there is nothing, no horizon, no reference, no up and no down, just a black that goes in every direction simultaneously, and inside that black, a jet moving at 500 miles per hour, and inside that jet, a pilot whose entire universe has been reduced to the instruments in front of her and the sound of her own breathing. This is the environment that kills experienced pilots. Not mechanical failure, not enemy fire, not bad weather in the traditional sense, just darkness, and the lies it tells your body about where you are. Maya Reyes had been briefed on spatial disorientation in flight school. She had studied the case files. She knew the statistics. She knew that it was responsible for more naval aviation fatalities than any other single factor. She knew it intellectually, completely, the way you can know something that has not yet happened to you. On the night of November 14, 2020, she learned it the different way. The mission had begun as routine as carrier operations ever get. A two-ship patrol, Maya on wing, Lieutenant Commander Hawk Harrington on lead, out over the Philippine Sea, approximately 340 miles east of the carrier. Standard reconnaissance pattern. Estimated flight time, 4 hours. Weather at departure, manageable. A weather system moving in from the northwest, but the meteorological officer had assessed it as slow-moving. Plenty of time to complete the pattern and recover aboard before conditions deteriorated. The meteorological officer was wrong. At 1:47 a.m. local time, the weather system accelerated in a way that the models had not predicted, a rapid intensification that pushed it east 3 times faster than projected. By the time the updated weather data reached the carrier and was relayed to the two-ship, they were already inside the outer edge of it. Hawk's voice came over the radio, controlled, professional. The voice of someone who has been in bad situations before and knows that the voice is the first thing you have to manage. Two-ship, weather is deteriorating faster than projected. We're going to tighten up the pattern and recover early. Stay close, stay on instruments. Acknowledge. Copy, Maya said. Acknowledged. They tightened the pattern, began the recovery sequence, turned back toward the carrier. That was when Hawk's aircraft took the bird strike. It happened in an instant, the way catastrophic things always happen, with no ceremony, no warning, no moment that announces itself as the moment everything changes. A large seabird, later identified as an albatross, a species with a wingspan approaching 11 feet, struck Hawk's left engine intake at 1:52 a.m. The engine compressor stalled immediately. The aircraft yawed hard left. Hawk's radio call was 2 words, clipped and precise the way emergency calls always are when the person making them is managing fear in real time. Engine out! Maya heard it and felt everything in her compress. Not panic, not fear, but that same deep, trained focus that had come back to her in the cockpit over the Gulf of Mexico on week 7 of training. The part of her that existed below the emotion, the part that simply acted. Copy engine out. I have you visual. What's your status? Controllable. Single engine. I need to talk on to the boat. The problem was immediate and severe. In the weather system, with no visual horizon, with one engine out and the aircraft handling asymmetrically, Hawk needed to fly purely on instruments, while Maya, flying formation beside him in conditions that were rapidly approaching the edge of flyable, talked him through corrections and relayed his position to the carrier. It was the most demanding thing she had ever been asked to do. And it was about to get harder. At 1:59 a.m., Maya's radar took a hit from the electromagnetic interference generated by the storm system. Not a complete failure, a degradation. Enough to make the returns unreliable. Enough to mean she could not fully trust what her instruments were telling her about Hawk's position relative to hers. She had to fly formation on him visually. In a storm, at night, over black ocean with no horizon. She could see his aircraft only by its navigation lights, 2 small points of red and green moving through the dark ahead of her, disappearing into cloud, reappearing, disappearing again. She had to hold position relative to those 2 lights without any external reference, without being able to trust her own body's sense of which way was up, using only her instruments and the discipline to believe them over everything her nervous system was screaming at her. This is what spatial disorientation actually is. It is not confusion. It is a very specific, very convincing lie. Your inner ear, the mechanism your body uses to sense orientation, cannot distinguish between certain kinds of turns and straight and level flight. In cloud, with no visual reference, it will tell you with complete authority that you are wings level when you are in a 30-degree bank. It will tell you that you are climbing when you are descending. It will tell you, calmly and convincingly and with total confidence, things that are completely wrong. The only defense is to ignore it, to look at your instruments and believe them over your own body, to fly what the gauges say, not what you feel. This sounds straightforward. It is one of the hardest things a human being can do. Maya did it for 22 minutes. 22 minutes of holding formation on two small colored lights through storm cloud and black ocean, ignoring everything her body told her, talking hawk through corrections, relaying position data to the carrier, managing her own aircraft, and doing all of it simultaneously while the weather pushed at them both and the darkness pressed in from every direction. At 2:19 a.m., the carrier's precision approach radar locked on to both aircraft. At 2:31 a.m., Hawk's aircraft touched down on the deck. Single engine, night recovery, in weather, clean landing. At 2:33 a.m., Maya trapped aboard 17 seconds behind him. She sat in the cockpit for a moment after the aircraft stopped. Just sat there. Her hands were completely steady. She noticed that, the steadiness of them, and filed it away somewhere private. Then she climbed out. Hawk was standing on the deck when she came down off the aircraft. His helmet was off. His face was doing something complicated. The face of a man recalibrating something he thought he had already figured out. He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the deck crew moved efficiently in the wind and rain, chaining down aircraft, moving equipment. Nobody was watching. Or maybe everyone was watching. It was hard to tell. Hawk said, "That was the best piece of formation flying I have ever seen." He said it the way people say true things when they have resisted saying them for a long time. Flatly, without decoration. Maya looked at him. "You would have done the same." "No," he said. And he said it with a certainty that was not false modesty. "I wouldn't have. Not like that." He put his hand out. She shook it. And something that had been suspended since the day she walked onto that deck, something that had been watching and waiting and withholding, finally came down on her side. Word travels fast on a carrier, faster than any official report, faster than any debrief. By morning, every pilot in VFA 27 knew what had happened over the Philippine Sea. By the end of the week, so did Commander Lassiter. And 6 months after that, in a decision that sent a ripple through the entire Pacific Fleet, so did the selection board. In Chapter 6, the final chapter, they give her the command. And the men who laughed on that deck the day she arrived must now stand in formation and salute. But what Maya does in that moment, what she says and what she doesn't say, is the part of this story that nobody expected. The selection board met on a Wednesday. Room 12B at Naval Air Station North Island, San Diego. 7 officers around a rectangular table. A stack of files. A decision that none of them had expected to be making this soon about this person at this particular moment in naval aviation history. The file in the center of the table belonged to Lieutenant Maya Reyes. Age, 19 years, 8 months. Flight hours, 847. Combat sorties, 12. Commendations, 3. Including a formal letter of merit from Commander Brett Lassiter that used the phrase generational talent, a phrase Lassiter had never used before in 20 years of writing officer evaluations. The board reviewed the file for 40 minutes. Then the senior officer, a 2-star admiral named Wallace Kipp, who had spent 30 years in naval aviation and had the particular stillness of someone who had stopped being surprised by most things, looked around the table and said, "Any objections?" There were none. They signed the paperwork. And Lieutenant Maya Reyes, 19 years old, from a 2-bedroom trailer in Laredo, Texas, daughter of a sheet metal worker who had once told her, gently and with love, that this was not their world. became the youngest officer ever appointed to command a strike fighter squadron in United States naval history. The official change of command ceremony was scheduled for a Tuesday morning on the flight deck of the USS Ronald Reagan. These ceremonies follow a precise, centuries-old protocol. The outgoing commander stands on the right, the incoming commander stands on the left. The squadron forms up in ranks between them. The command pennant is transferred, words are spoken, salutes are exchanged. The whole thing takes approximately 22 minutes and has looked essentially the same since the Navy was young. Maya had attended 2 of these ceremonies before, had stood in the ranks, had watched the transfer of authority happen with the formal, almost theatrical gravity that military ceremony does better than almost anything else on Earth. She had never stood on the left side before. The morning of the ceremony, she was up at 4:30, not because she needed to be, she simply couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk for an hour staring at the overhead, listening to the sounds of the carrier, the deep, constant mechanical breath of it, the distant clang of something on the deck above, the faint vibration through the hull that never entirely stops. She thought about the list she had made at 16. 4 items, written at a kitchen table in Laredo with a rejection letter in front of her and exactly $23 in her drawer. She thought about Hector Fuentes and his terrible coffee. She thought about her father's face when she told him she had taken her first solo flight. She thought about room 4C in Pensacola, about the furnace, about the 3 seconds over the Gulf of Mexico when everything left her and the trained part came back. She thought about 2 small lights, red and green, moving through a black storm over the Philippine Sea. At 5:15, she got up, dressed, and went to the flight deck alone. The Pacific was quiet that morning. The sky was the color of steel, slowly warming toward gold along the eastern edge. The aircraft on the deck were chained and still. There was nobody else out there, just Maya and the wind and the ocean going in every direction as far as she could see. She stood at the edge of the deck for a long time. She was not thinking about the ceremony. She was not thinking about the title or the history she was about to make, or the way this story would be told later by people who hadn't been there. She was thinking about something smaller and more specific. She was thinking about what she owed. Not to the Navy, not to history, not to any abstract idea about representation or breaking barriers or proving something to the world. To the people who had stood in the gap for her, who had given what they had, which was sometimes very little, but was always everything they had, so that she could be standing on this deck at this particular moment. Hector Fuentes, Mr. Dominguez, Lieutenant Commander Sandra O'Coffer, Hawk Harrington, who had told her the truth and then watched her prove it. Her mother, who had set an envelope on a table without a word and watched her daughter fold it back along its creases and pick up a pencil. Her father, who had said, "This is not our world," and was not wrong about the world he knew, and was simply standing in a world that was about to change. She took one long breath of salt air. Then she turned and walked back inside to prepare for the ceremony. At 9 a.m., the squadron formed up on the deck. 12 pilots in dress whites, standing in precise ranks in the Pacific morning light, the ocean behind them, the carrier's island structure rising to their right, the sky enormous and clear overhead. Maya walked out last. She heard it, the almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere that happens when something unexpected occurs in a formal setting. A dozen men, trained to stillness, going slightly more still. Not from disrespect, from something closer to awe, the specific awe of witnessing something you understand rationally, but haven't yet processed emotionally. She was 19 years old. She was walking to the left side of this formation. She was going to be their commander. Commander Lassiter conducted the ceremony. His voice was steady and formal and correct in every particular. The words were spoken, the pennant was transferred, the salutes were exchanged, and then it was Maya's turn to speak. She had written and discarded 4 versions of this speech. The first version was about history, about what this moment represented, about doors and barriers and the long arc of progress. She discarded it because it was about the wrong things. The second version was about the squadron, about their record, their legacy, their excellence. She discarded it because it felt like a performance. The third version was personal, about Laredo, about the trailer, about the flying club and the rejection letter. She discarded it because this moment wasn't about her either. The fourth version was 1 page, 12 sentences. She discarded that too. What she said instead, standing in front of 12 men on the deck of a carrier in the Pacific, was this: "I'm not going to tell you that I've earned your respect. Respect isn't transferred in a ceremony. It's built in the air, and I know that, and you know that, and we understand each other." She paused. Let that land. What I will tell you is this. Every person who ever told me no, every closed door, every rejection letter, every room where someone looked at me and saw a limitation instead of a pilot, every single one of those things made me better at this job. Not in spite of the resistance, because of it. Another pause. So I don't carry any of that as a grievance. I carry it as fuel. She looked along the line of them, all 12 faces, including Hawk Harrington's, which was doing that complicated thing again, that recalibrating thing. We have work to do. Let's go do it. 22 seconds. That was the entire speech. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Hawk Harrington, Lieutenant Commander James Harrington, 8 years of carrier experience, Silver Star candidate, the man who had told her she got here too fast, brought his hand up in a salute. Crisp, precise, complete. One by one, the others followed. 12 salutes, on a flight deck, in the Pacific morning. Maya Reyes returned them. Later, months later, when the story had been written about in naval aviation journals and told in ready rooms across 3 carrier groups, and eventually found its way into the kind of articles that get passed around with the subject line, "You need to read this," someone asked Hawk Harrington what he had been thinking in that moment. He thought about it for a while. Then he said, "I was thinking that I had been wrong about something, and that being wrong about it was one of the best things that ever happened to me professionally. Because watching someone be that good, watching someone do what she did and become what she became, that makes you better too, if you're paying attention." He paused. I was paying attention. Maya Reyes called her father that evening. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear the television in the background, the same channel he always watched, the same volume, the same sounds of the house she had grown up in. She told him what had happened, calmly, simply, the way she always told him things. There was a long silence on the line. Then Carlos Reyes, a quiet man, a practical man, a man who had once told his 7-year-old daughter with love and genuine conviction that this was not their world, said, "Mija." Just that, just her name, but the way he said it contained everything. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know why it matters. Not because Maya Reyes broke a record. Records get broken. That's what they're for. But because of the list she made at 16 with $23 in her drawer. Because of the 4 a.m. mornings nobody saw. Because of the 3 seconds over the Gulf of Mexico when everything left her and she got up at 4 in the morning and started drilling anyway. The door doesn't always open when you knock. Sometimes you have to become the kind of person the door has no choice but to open for. If this story meant something to you, share it with one person who needs to hear it today. And if you want the next story, the next person who was counted out and refused to stay there, subscribe, because we're just getting started.